The sun beat down on the manicured lawns of Azure Heights with a relentless intensity, but Elena didn't mind the heat as much as she minded the silence of the neighborhood. It was the kind of silence that only money could buy, a stillness broken only by the rhythmic scuff of her knees against the stone driveway and the harsh bristles of her brush. She adjusted her oversized, faded gray uniform, the fabric stiff with dried soap and sweat. To any passerby, she was just a ghost in the machinery of luxury, an invisible fixture scrubbing away the sins of a leaked oil pan. She kept her head low, her eyes focused on the gray swirl of suds, her mind miles away until the clicking of high heels against the pavement signaled the end of her piece. Victoria Sterling didn't just walk, she occupied space as if she had patented the air itself. She stepped out of her massive Mediterranean-style villa, her silk wrap dress fluttering in the breeze, clutching a tiny, trembling Pomeranian that wore a diamond-studded collar. In her other hand, she held a tall glass of vibrant green juice, the condensation dripping onto her perfectly manicured French tips. She stopped just inches from Elena's bucket, her shadow stretching over the Maid like a dark shroud. Victoria didn't say hello, she didn't even look Elena in the eye. Instead, she slowly tilted her glass, watching with a twisted sort of curiosity as the thick, green liquid poured out in a steady stream, splashing directly into the clean rinse water and splattering across Elena's worn-out sneakers. "What is this?" Victoria's voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the afternoon air as she mocked Elena's Eastern European lilt with cruel, exaggerated phonetics. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Honestly, Elena, or whatever your name is, I don't know why we even bother with your kind. You missed a spot right there by the flower bed. Do you even speak English, or is your brain as thick as that ridiculous accent? I pay a premium for this and I won't have my driveway looking like a slum just because you're too illiterate to follow basic instructions." Elena paused, her fingers tightening around the wooden handle of the scrub brush. She felt the sting of the green juice on her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She kept her gaze fixed on the wet stone, her voice coming out as a soft, rhythmic murmur that she had practiced for months. "I am so sorry, ma'am," she whispered, the accent thick and heavy, exactly as Victoria expected it to be. "I will clean it again. I make it perfect for you." She forced a slight tremble into her hands, playing the part of the broken servant to perfection. Victoria scoffed, rolling her eyes toward the sky as if she were a martyr suffering through an impossible ordeal. Beside her, Marcus, her personal assistant, stepped forward. He was a younger man in a slim-fit suit, his eyes glued to his smartphone as he hit the record button. He didn't say a word to stop the abuse. Instead, he snickered, angling the camera to catch the juice dripping from Elena's uniform. He was the perfect sycophant, feeding off Victoria's toxicity like a parasite. "Look at her, Marcus," Victoria sneered, gesturing vaguely at Elena's kneeling form. "It's like she doesn't even understand the concept of property value. You're stinking up the whole neighborhood, Elena. You look like a stray dog that wandered onto the wrong porch." From the second-story window of the mansion, a small, pale face pressed against the glass. It was Leo, Victoria's 7-year-old son. His eyes were wide with a mixture of confusion and deep, silent shame. He watched his mother kick Elena's bucket, sending a wave of gray water across the sidewalk, but he didn't move. He had seen this play out 100 times before, and he knew that any intervention would only turn the fire toward him. He watched the maid bow her head even lower, her shoulders shaking slightly, and he felt a knot of cold dread tighten in his stomach. Victoria leaned down, the scent of her expensive, cloying floral perfume clashing violently with the smell of the wet concrete. "Listen to me very carefully, you pathetic little mouse," she hissed, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I want you off this property, and I want you out of this neighborhood by sunset. I don't care if your job isn't finished. I'm calling the police and I'm calling ICE. I'll tell them you were aggressive, that you tried to steal something. I want you gone before my husband gets home and has to see your disgusting, dirty face. Do you understand me, or do I need to get a translator to tell you that you're trash?" Elena finally looked up, but not with the fear Victoria was hunting for. For a split second, the mask of the humble maid slipped, revealing a gaze that was as cold and sharp as an Arctic winter. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, and didn't look away. "I understand everything, Victoria," she said, the accent still present but her tone suddenly carrying a weight that made Marcus stop laughing. "I understand more than you can possibly imagine." Victoria bristled, her face flushing a deep, ugly red as she realized the maid had dared to use her first name. But before she could scream, Elena lowered her eyes again, returning to the stones, the secret fire hidden once more behind a veil of grey fabric and feigned submission. The storm had begun, and Victoria Sterling had no idea she was standing right in the center of the lightning path. The golden light of the California afternoon seemed to freeze as Victoria's threats hung in the air, but for Elena, the world was already beginning to shift. To understand the fire burning behind Elena's eyes, one had to look back 15 years, to a time when her name wasn't whispered in shame, but spoken with reverence in the marble halls of London's financial district. Back then, Elena wasn't wearing a faded uniform, she was a force of nature. She remembered the feeling of heavy silk against her skin and the weight of a master's degree from the world's most prestigious business school in her hand. She had been the star, the brilliant daughter of a legendary real estate mogul whose empire spanned 3 continents. But her father was a man who believed that power without perspective was a hollow pursuit. She could still see him in her mind, his face pale and sunken against the white pillows of his hospital bed, his hand trembling as he reached for hers. "Elena," he had wheezed, his voice a ghost of its former thunder. "Anyone can sit in a high tower and sign a check. But a true leader knows the soul of the streets. They know the weight of the broom and the sting of the cold. I am leaving you everything, but you must promise me one thing. Before you take my seat, you must live among the people we serve. You must see the world through the eyes of those the world refuses to see. Only then will you be fit to wear this crown." It was that promise that had led her here, but the roots of this conflict went even deeper, twisting into a past Victoria Sterling had long since suppressed. A decade ago, a younger, hungrier Victoria had sat in a sleek glass office, her knuckles white as she gripped her resume. She had been applying for a senior executive role at Elena's family firm. Elena, hidden behind a one-way mirror during the final round of interviews, had watched as Victoria dismissed the receptionist with a snap of her fingers and mocked the janitor's shoes when she thought no one was looking. Elena had seen the rot in Victoria's soul even then. She had marked the application with a single, decisive word in red ink: rejected. Victoria never saw the face of the woman who ended her corporate ambitions. She only knew that a woman named Elena had deemed her unworthy of the brand. Fast forward to 6 months ago, when reports of systemic abuse and financial irregularities began to leak from Azure Heights, one of the crown jewels of Elena's newly inherited portfolio. Most CEOs would have sent a team of lawyers or a private investigator, but Elena remembered her father's dying wish. She didn't want a report, she wanted the truth. She had traded her designer suits for a box of cleaning supplies and a bottle of industrial bleach. She had spent weeks practicing the heavy, rhythmic cadence of an Eastern European accent, knowing that people like Victoria Sterling saw an accent as a sign of low intelligence. A perfect camouflage for a woman who was actually calculating the square footage of Victoria's debt. Elena had stood in the Azure Heights management office during her interview for the maid position, intentionally fumbling her English and keeping her shoulders hunched. The association manager had barely looked at her, seeing only a pair of hands to do the work no one else wanted. It was there that she first encountered Victoria, who had walked into the office complaining about the quality of the help these days. Victoria had looked right through Elena, treating her like a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong room. Elena had watched Victoria's cruelty grow day by day, documenting every microaggression and every stolen dollar from the community funds. Back in the present, the cold water from the bucket soaked into Elena's socks, a physical reminder of the role she was playing. The tension in the driveway was no longer just about a spilled drink. It was the collision of 2 lives that had been on a crash course for years. Victoria stood there, preening in her expensive wrap dress, entirely unaware that the woman she was calling trash was the same woman who held the deed to her very existence. The irony was a bitter pill that Elena swallowed in silence. Victoria thought she was exercising her power, but she was merely a puppet in a much larger play. Every insult Victoria hurled, every mocking laugh at Elena's supposed illiteracy, was being recorded not just by Marcus's phone, but by the high-resolution microcamera hidden in the second button of Elena's uniform. Elena felt the weight of her father's legacy pressing on her heart. She wasn't just doing this for the company, she was doing it for every person who had ever been made to feel small by a woman with a designer bag and a hollow heart. As she looked at Victoria's sneering face, Elena didn't feel anger. She felt a cold, clinical sense of purpose. The girl from the London boardroom was still there, beneath the stains and the sweat, and she was currently counting down the minutes until Victoria Sterling's world came crashing down around her expensive heels. The past was no longer behind them, it was about to become Victoria's future. The breaking point didn't come with a shout, but with the deceptive glitter of a diamond tennis bracelet catching the sunlight. Victoria Sterling's face had twisted into something predatory, a sharp contrast to the soft silk of her designer wrap dress. She wasn't content with just firing Elena, she wanted a total, humiliating annihilation. While Elena was busy gathering the sodden rags from the driveway, Victoria moved with the practiced stealth of a snake. She reached into her velvet-lined jewelry box, pulled out a 14-carat heirloom, and with a flick of her wrist, dropped it deep into the pocket of Elena's cleaning cart, burying it beneath a pile of damp, lemon-scented microfiber towels. Marcus, standing nearby with his phone still aimed like a weapon, didn't miss a beat. He didn't protest. Instead, he leaned in and whispered into his microphone, ensuring the evidence was part of his digital narrative. Victoria then drew a sharp, theatrical breath and let out a scream that echoed through the cul-de-sac. Police! Help! My bracelet! Someone call the police! She began frantically patting her empty wrist, her eyes wide with a performative panic that was as fake as her tan. Marcus, play your part, she snapped, and within seconds, the quiet street was alive with the sound of opening front doors. Victoria didn't wait for the authorities to arrive before she began the public shaming. She marched to the center of the manicured lawn, her voice booming so every neighbor could hear. Everyone, come out here. We have a thief in our midst. She pointed a trembling finger at Elena, who stood frozen beside her cart. I tried to be kind. I tried to give this person a chance despite her background and that ridiculous accent. And this is how she repays me? By stealing a family heirloom right out of my bedroom? It's unbelievable. It's absolutely disgusting. One by one, the neighbors emerged. Men in golf shirts and women in yoga gear, their faces hardening with instant judgment. They circled around Elena like a pack of wolves sensing a weak deer. They didn't ask for proof, they didn't ask for her side of the story. They simply saw a woman in a stained uniform and a woman in a mansion, and they knew who to believe. Shame on you, one woman yelled from her porch. We don't want people like you in Azure Heights. Go back to where you came from. The air grew thick with a toxic mix of elitism and xenophobia, the insults raining down on Elena like stones. Elena stood in the center of the storm, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She felt the isolation like a physical coldness, a vast, empty space between her and the rest of humanity. No one stepped forward. No one said, wait, let's hear her out. She was a ghost again, but this time, a ghost being exorcised. She looked toward Marcus, who had momentarily stopped filming. For a fleeting second, he offered her a tissue, his face softening into a mask of sympathy. Here, you look like you're about to cry, he whispered. But as Elena reached for it, his expression shifted into a cruel, jagged smirk. Don't worry, he hissed, just loud enough for her to hear. I made sure the camera caught every bit of your pathetic little breakdown. It's going to get so many views. Just as the despair seemed total, a side gate creaked open. Mr. Henderson, an elderly veteran who lived 2 houses down, hobbled toward the edge of the lawn on his cane. He didn't join the shouting. He just stood there, his eyes narrowed, watching the scene with a grim intensity. He had seen Victoria planting the jewelry from his balcony, but he remained silent, his jaw set in a hard line. He was the silent ally Elena didn't know she had, a witness to the injustice who was waiting for the right moment to strike. The sound of sirens finally tore through the neighborhood, the red and blue lights reflecting off the oversized windows of the surrounding estates. Two officers stepped out of their cruiser, their hands hovering near their belts. Victoria immediately rushed toward them, her eyes brimming with crocodile tears. "Officer, thank God you're here. She's right there. She took it. It's in her cart. I saw her do it." She pointed at the cleaning supplies with a flourish of her hand. One officer approached Elena, his face stern and unforgiving. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he commanded. Elena didn't fight. She didn't scream. She simply felt the cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs clicking shut around her wrists. As she was being led toward the patrol car, Victoria leaned in, her perfume so strong it was nauseating. "You thought you were so smart with your little, 'I am sorry ma'am,' act," she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "But look at you now. You're exactly where you belong. In the back of a cage, you illiterate peasant." Elena stopped. She didn't look at the officer or the crowd. She turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto Victoria's with a sudden, chilling clarity. The breaking point had arrived, but it wasn't Elena who had broken. The silence that followed was heavy with a hidden truth that was about to explode. The metal of the handcuffs was biting into Elena's wrists, a cold and clinical reminder of her supposed defeat. As the officer began to lead her toward the patrol car, Marcus stepped forward, his face twisted into a mask of faux concern. "Wait, officer," he called out, his voice loud enough to ensure the gathering crowd of neighbors didn't miss a single syllable. "I think there's more. I saw her shoving something else into that raggedy old bag of hers." Marcus reached into the side pocket of Elena's canvas satchel and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He held it up like a trophy. "Look at this. It's a deed to one of the properties on the hill. She was trying to forge documents or squat. This woman isn't just a thief, she's a professional scammer." Victoria let out a jagged, hysterical laugh, her eyes wide with malicious glee. "Oh, this is rich," she screamed, turning to face the neighbors who were already recording the scene on their iPhones. "Did you hear that? She was trying to steal a house. I told you these people have no boundaries. They come here, they take our jobs, they steal our jewelry, and now they think they can just own the roof over our heads." She looked back at Elena, her face inches away, her breath smelling of expensive mints and arrogance. "You really thought you were going to pull one over on us, didn't you? You thought you were so clever with that little act. But look at you now. You're nothing. You're lower than the dirt I pay you to scrub." The crowd erupted in a chorus of jeers, but Elena didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the cream-colored envelope in Marcus's hand. The false defeat was complete. In the eyes of the law and the public, she was a criminal caught red-handed. The officers pushed her into the hard plastic seat of the patrol car, the door slamming shut with a heavy, final thud that seemed to signal the end of her life. Victoria stood on her lawn, waving mockingly as the car began to pull away, her laughter echoing through the air like a siren. But as the police cruiser rounded the corner and the cheering crowd faded into the distance, the atmosphere inside the car changed. Elena didn't weep. She didn't beg for mercy. Instead, she leaned her head back against the seat and let out a long, slow breath. The fear that had lived in her eyes for the last hour vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating brilliance. With a subtle movement, she shifted her weight and reached into the hidden lining of her sock, pulling out a small, encrypted burner phone. Her fingers moved with lightning speed, bypassing the lock screen. She didn't look like a maid anymore. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield. She pressed a single contact. "It's me," she said, her voice dropping the heavy accent entirely. The pitch was crisp, authoritative, and vibrated with the power of a woman who owned cities. "Phase 2 is a go. Victoria Sterling just handed me the final piece of the puzzle on camera. I want you to initiate the immediate liquidation of the Sterling family accounts. Freeze the Azure Heights Management Fund and pull the audit records I flagged this morning. Every cent they've embezzled needs to be documented by the time I reach the precinct." There was a brief pause as the person on the other end responded. Elena's lips curled into a faint, dangerous smile. "And one more thing," she continued. "Contact our legal team at the firm. Tell them I want the eviction notices for the Sterling residents served by 5 page M. today. Use the morality clause in the association bylaws. If she wants to talk about community standards, let's show her exactly what ours look like. Elena tucked the phone back into her hiding spot just as the officer glanced in the rearview mirror. He saw only a quiet, defeated woman staring out the window, but internally, Elena had already moved on from being the victim. She was no longer reacting to Victoria's cruelty, she was orchestrating its downfall. She thought back to the envelope Marcus had brandished. It wasn't a forgery, and it certainly wasn't a stolen deed. It was the master title for the entire Azure Heights development, signed by the holding company she controlled. Victoria had literally held the evidence of Elena's ownership in her own hands and was too blinded by her own prejudice to read the name on the front. The long game was almost over. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the hum of the engine, feeling the weight of the handcuffs. They were a temporary inconvenience, a small price to pay for the sheer, surgical precision of the justice she was about to deliver. By the time the sun set on Azure Heights, the neighborhood wouldn't just be losing a maid, it would be meeting its new landlord. While the police cruiser pulled away toward the local precinct, the atmosphere at the Sterling mansion was nothing short of celebratory. Victoria sat on her white leather sofa, her legs crossed elegantly as she sipped a chilled glass of rosé. She felt a profound sense of accomplishment, the kind that only comes from successfully purging one's environment of an eyesore. She checked her reflection in her gold-rimmed vanity mirror, adjusting her hair and laughing as she replayed the video Marcus had captured. "Did you see her face, Marcus?" she asked, her voice light and musical with malice. That look of utter confusion when the handcuffs went on. It's exactly what she deserved for coming into my home with that hideous, grating voice of hers. I honestly feel like I've done the whole neighborhood a service. Marcus nodded obediently, though his eyes remained fixed on his tablet. He was busy, polishing the footage, adding dramatic captions like "Thief Exposed" and "Karen Wins" to ensure the video would go viral by morning. Victoria was already planning her next move, envisioning a victory brunch with the other ladies of the association. She truly believed she had won, that the trash had been collected and disposed of, leaving her world pristine and unchallenged once again. She was so blinded by the glow of her own ego that she failed to notice the subtle tremors beginning to shake the foundation of her life. Less than 2 miles away, the reality was starkly different. Elena sat in a private, soundproofed room at the back of the precinct, but the handcuffs were gone. In their place was a sleek, silver laptop and a glass of sparkling water. She was flanked by 2 of the highest-paid corporate attorneys in the state, men who usually only appeared in the presence of senators or tech titans. The humble, broken-accented Maid had vanished entirely. Elena's posture was straight, her movements were fluid and precise, and her voice was a cool, sharp instrument of command. "I want the forensic audit on Victoria's husband completed by midnight," she told her lead counsel. "I know he's been skimming from the neighborhood improvement fund to pay for that Italian marble in their foyer. I want every receipt, every wire transfer, and every forged signature." For the next several hours, Elena worked with a silent, relentless intensity. This was the grind that no one saw, the painstaking process of dismantling an enemy piece by piece. She wasn't throwing a tantrum, she was building a cage. She made a series of encrypted phone calls to her holding company's board of directors, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she authorized the final buyout of the Azure Heights Management Group. She was no longer just a resident or a witness, she was becoming the literal ground beneath Victoria's feet. Every time a neighbor had spat an insult at her on the lawn, she had simply added another zero to the damages she intended to collect. As night fell, Elena took a moment to meet privately with Mr. Henderson, who had been brought to the station as a witness. The elderly veteran looked at her, his eyes taking in the expensive silk blouse she had changed into and the sheer authority radiating from her. "I knew there was something about you," he said, a faint smile touching his weathered face. "You took those insults like a soldier, Elena." She reached out and squeezed his hand, her expression softening for the first time all day. "Thank you for standing by me, Mr. Henderson. Tomorrow, this neighborhood is going to change. I'm going to make sure that no one ever has to feel small here again." While Elena was setting the final trap, Victoria was upstairs in her walk-in closet, picking out a gown for the Gala of Gratitude She had been invited to. She saw a notification on her phone about a change in the neighborhood's ownership, but she swiped it away with a distracted, She assumed it was just more boring paperwork from the WA. She stood before her full-length mirror, practicing her humbled face for the speech she planned to give, completely unaware that the very walls around her were no longer hers. She felt untouchable, basking in the false light of a victory that was actually a countdown to her ruin. Elena, meanwhile, sat in her hotel suite, staring at the finished legal briefs. The silent preparation was over. The trap was set, the evidence was ironclad, and the hunter was ready to step out of the shadows. The Azure Heights clubhouse had been transformed into a cathedral of excess. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a shimmering, restless light over the ballroom, reflecting off the polished marble floors and the endless flutes of vintage champagne. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the kind of expensive, musky perfumes that seem to signal status before a person even speaks. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music barely rising above the sophisticated hum of the neighborhood's elite. This was the Gala of Gratitude, and for Victoria Sterling, it felt like her own personal coronation. Victoria floated through the crowd in a floor-length crimson gown that gripped the floor like a bloodstain. She held a glass of gold-flecked champagne, her laughter ringing out like a series of sharp, rhythmic bell strikes. She was surrounded by a circle of nodding neighbors, all of them eager to hear her recount her bravery. "Oh, it was just terrifying," she said, leaning in as if sharing a grand secret, though her voice carried to the back of the room. "This woman was practically in my bedroom, speaking that garbled, unintelligible nonsense. I truly believe she was part of some international crime ring. Honestly, it's a miracle I'm standing here today." Marcus was at her elbow, playing the role of the devoted courtier. He checked his watch, a smirk playing on his lips. "Any minute now, Victoria." The management group said the guest of honor would be making an appearance to announce the new community initiatives. Victoria preened, adjusting her diamond necklace. "I'm sure they'll want me on stage to talk about our victory. It's about time this neighborhood realized that keeping certain elements out is the only way to protect our investments." She looked around the room with an air of supreme ownership, catching the eye of Mr. Henderson. The old veteran sat quietly at a table in the back, his arms crossed, watching her with a look of stoic expectation that she mistook for jealousy. A chime echoed through the hall, and the lights dimmed to a dramatic, focused glow on the main stage. A massive high-definition screen flickered to life, displaying a golden emblem of the community. A hush fell over the crowd as the master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We are honored to finally introduce the new majority shareholder of Azure Heights Development and the chairperson of the Sterling Vance Global Group." Victoria leaned forward, her heart racing with excitement. She expected a man in a tuxedo, perhaps an old family friend of her husband's. She was already practicing the graceful, humble nod she would give when she was inevitably called up for her contribution to community safety. The screen behind the podium didn't show a corporate logo. Instead, it flickered to a grainy, handheld video. The room went cold as the speakers began to broadcast a very familiar voice. "What is this? You missed a spot, you illiterate peasant." The ballroom gasped as they watched the video of Victoria on her driveway, her face twisted in a sneer that looked monstrous when projected 30 feet high. The footage showed her pouring the green juice, the mocking laughter, and then, most damningly, a clear, slow-motion shot of her hand slipping a diamond bracelet into a cleaning cart. Victoria's face went from a triumphant red to a sickly, translucent white. Her glass of champagne began to tremble in her hand, the bubbles popping in a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the room. Marcus stepped back away from her, his phone tucked away, his expression shifting from sycophant to a cold, professional mask. Victoria tried to speak, but her throat felt like it was filled with ash. This is a mistake," she croaked, looking around at the neighbors who were now staring at her with a mixture of horror and disgust. "That video is a fake. It's a deep fake." She turned toward the stage, expecting someone to stop the recording, but the screen changed again. It displayed a massive legal document, a mortgage foreclosure notice with Victoria's home address and her husband's signature prominently at the bottom, marked in bold red as defaulted. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as a figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the hall. The clicking of heels on the marble floor sounded like the ticking of a clock. Elena walked into the light, and the collective breath of the room hitched. She wasn't wearing the gray uniform or the hunched shoulders of a servant. She wore a midnight blue silk gown that moved like water and a sapphire necklace that made Victoria's jewelry look like costume plastic. Her hair was swept back in a sharp, elegant style, and her eyes were fixed on Victoria with the terrifying focus of a predator. Elena stepped onto the stage, the microphone catching the subtle rustle of her dress. She didn't look at the crowd, she looked directly at the woman in the red dress who was now clutching the back of a chair to keep from falling. "I believe you wanted to discuss community standards, Victoria," Elena said. Her voice was perfectly clear, devoid of any accent, ringing with the authority of someone who had never known a day of subservience in her life. The atmosphere was electric, the tension coiled so tight it felt like the very air might snap. Every eye in the room was locked on the two women, the mock queen in her fading red and the true owner in her midnight blue. The grand setup was over, the reckoning had arrived. The silence in the clubhouse was so absolute it felt physical, a vacuum that sucked the air out of Victoria Sterling's lungs. She stood paralyzed at the foot of the stage, her crimson dress suddenly looking like a garish costume in the presence of true power. Elena stood behind the podium, her silhouette framed by the flickering evidence of Victoria's crimes on the giant screen. The transformation was total. The woman who had spent weeks scrubbing floors now commanded the room with a silence that was more terrifying than any scream. Victoria's hand shook so violently that her champagne glass shattered against the marble floor, the crystal shards mimicking the sudden disintegration of her life. She looked around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's, but she found no refuge. The neighbors who had cheered for her just days ago were now shrinking away, their faces twisted with a mixture of shock and self-preservation. "This is a lie," Victoria finally shrieked, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate wail. "I don't know who this woman is, but she's a fraud. She's a criminal who stole my jewelry and now she's hacked the system. Someone call security. Get this peasant off the stage." Elena leaned into the microphone, and the sheer resonance of her voice seemed to vibrate in the very walls. Her English was flawless, her tone carrying the crisp, inherited authority of 1,000 boardrooms. "You can stop shouting, Victoria. The security team you're calling is currently on my payroll, and the police you're so fond of are waiting in the lobby. Not for me, but for your husband." She took a slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the stage, looking down at Victoria. "You spent so much time mocking my accent, laughing at a woman you thought was too uneducated to defend herself. You thought that because I spoke with a lilt, I couldn't understand the depth of your greed. But while you were busy recording your little videos for social media, I was recording the truth." Marcus, the assistant Victoria had treated like a lapdog, stepped away from her side and walked toward the stage. He didn't look back. He handed a leather-bound folder to Elena, his face a mask of professional neutrality. Victoria's jaw dropped as she watched the betrayal. "Marcus? What are you doing? I made you. I gave you everything." Marcus finally looked at her, and for the first time, there was no sycophantic smile. "No, Victoria," he said quietly. "You just paid me to watch you destroy yourself. I was hired by the Sterling Vance Group 6 months ago to document your community management. Every dollar you stole from the association, every bribe your husband took, and every person you bullied, it's all in here." Elena opened the folder, her eyes never leaving Victoria's pale, trembling face. "This morning, I exercised the morality clause in your deed. You see, when my company bought the Azure Heights development, we included a very specific provision about the conduct of its residents. Harassment, fraud, and criminal activity are grounds for immediate lease termination and foreclosure." She pulled out a single sheet of paper and held it up. "Victoria Sterling, you are no longer a resident of this community. Your assets have been frozen, your home has been reclaimed, and as of 5 minutes ago, your husband has been taken into custody for grand larceny and embezzlement." The room erupted into a low, frantic whispering, but Elena's voice cut through it like a hot blade through wax. "You looked at me and saw someone beneath you. You saw someone you could kick and humiliate because you thought your bank account gave you a soul. But the funny thing about status, Victoria, is that it's built on paper. And I own the paper. Elena's eyes flashed with a cold, righteous fire as she delivered the final, killing blow. You asked if I spoke English. Well, I speak it well enough to tell you this. Pack your bags. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises before the locks are changed. And don't bother looking for your jewelry. The police have the stolen bracelet you planted on me. It's being processed as evidence in a filing of false police reports and defamation. Victoria fell to her knees, the silk of her dress pooling in the spilled champagne. She looked up at Elena, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Please, she whispered, the arrogance finally stripped away, leaving nothing but a hollow, broken woman. I didn't know. I was just joking. We can work this out. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't offer a hand. She simply stood there, a monument to the justice Victoria had tried so hard to outrun. The lesson was being written in real time, carved into the stone of Victoria's ruined life. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered with the surgical precision of a woman who knew exactly what it felt like to be treated like dirt, and exactly what it took to clean it up. The aftermath of the gala was not a scene of chaotic celebration, but one of somber, quiet reconstruction. As the neighbors filed out of the clubhouse, their heads bowed in a sudden, sharp realization of their own complicity, Victoria Sterling was escorted to the curb by 2 private security guards. She didn't leave in a limousine, she left with her belongings stuffed into 3 mismatched trash bags, the red silk of her dress dragging through the dirt she had once forced Elena to scrub. Her husband's arrest had triggered a domino effect of frozen assets and repossessed luxury, leaving her standing on the sidewalk of the very neighborhood she had tried to gatekeep, realizing for the first time that she had no place left to go. Elena stood on the balcony of the clubhouse, watching the taillights of the patrol cars disappear into the night. She felt a profound sense of lightness, but it wasn't the lightness of revenge, it was the relief of a promise kept. The gray maid's uniform was gone, but she had instructed her team to have it cleaned and framed. It would hang in the main lobby of her corporate headquarters, a permanent reminder that the heart of a leader must always remain humble enough to clean the floors. She didn't feel the need to gloat. True power doesn't need to scream to be heard, and justice, she realized, was best served with a steady hand and a silent heart. In the weeks that followed, Azure Heights began to breathe again. Elena didn't sell the Sterling mansion to another billionaire. Instead, she converted the sprawling estate into the Foundations of Hope Center, a transition house and educational hub for immigrant families and workers who had been displaced by the very system Victoria had championed. She appointed Mr. Henderson as the community liaison, giving the old veteran a purpose that brought the spark back to his eyes. The neighborhood was no longer a fortress of exclusion, it was becoming a community of opportunity. Elena remained the owner, but she spent her weekends walking the grounds, speaking to the gardeners and the cleaning crews in their own languages, ensuring that every person who stepped onto that property felt the dignity they deserved. 5 years passed with the quiet grace of a changing season. Elena was walking through a public park on the other side of the city, the autumn air crisp and smelling of fallen leaves. She stopped at a bench to watch the children play when she noticed a woman in a bright orange vest, picking up litter along the pathway. The woman's hair was matted, her face lined with the deep, permanent shadows of exhaustion and regret. It was Victoria. There was no designer jewelry now, no cloying perfume, and no Pomeranian with a diamond collar. She moved with a heavy, slow gait, her eyes fixed on the trash at her feet, avoiding the gaze of anyone who passed by. Victoria reached for a discarded plastic bottle near Elena's boots, her hand trembling slightly. When she looked up and realized who was standing there, the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost of her former self. She didn't scream, and she didn't mock. She simply froze, her shoulders hunching as if she expected a blow that never came. Elena didn't say a word about the past. She didn't remind Victoria of the driveway, the green juice, or the false arrest. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out a cold bottle of water, and set it gently on the bench beside the woman. "You look like you could use a break," Elena said softly. Her voice was warm, carrying no trace of the cold authority she had used at the gala. Victoria looked at the water, then back at Elena, her eyes suddenly brimming with hot, shameful tears. I didn't know anything back then, Victoria whispered, her voice cracking. I thought I was everything because of what I had. Now I have nothing, and I finally see what I was. Elena offered a small, sad smile and placed a hand on Victoria's shoulder for just a moment, a gesture of human connection that Victoria had once deemed beneath her. It's never too late to start over, Victoria. Just remember that the way you treat people when you're at the top determines who will be there to catch you when you fall. As Elena walked away, she saw a young man in a university sweatshirt jogging toward the park entrance. It was Leo, Victoria's son. He had grown into a confident, kind young man, attending college on a full scholarship provided by Elena's foundation. He stopped to wave at Elena, a bright, genuine smile on his face, before heading toward the bench to sit with his mother. The cycle of hate had been broken, replaced by a legacy of grace that would outlast any mansion or bank account. Elena realized then that the greatest victory wasn't taking Victoria's home. It was giving her son a future where he would never repeat his mother's mistakes. The sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the grass. The world is a vast, complex place, but the lesson it teaches is remarkably simple. We are all walking each other home, and the clothes we wear or the accents we carry are nothing more than temporary disguises. Never judge a book by its cover, for the person you mock today might be the one who holds the keys to your tomorrow. Kindness costs nothing, but its value is infinite, and in the end, we aren't remembered by the power we held, but by the mercy we showed to those who had none.